Good morning, good morning, good morning. This is February the 12th, 2019. And we started our new book called The Amazing World of Kreskin. And we left off on, I believe it was chapter 4. And so we will resume at that point and continue reading. So we'll begin right now with chapter 4. Unlike psychometrist Peter Herkos, I took no falls from a ladder, nor was I ever dropped on my head. Neither has any member of my family, as far back as we can trace, ever been professionally involved in magic, or hypnosis, or thought perception, or any psychic field. My Aunt Anna Pikoski leaned toward it, certainly, but only as a hobby. And as far as we know, no one in the Polish, Italian, American family of Kreskin, and that's Kresge, ever concerned himself with ESP. I was born George Jr. in Montclair, New Jersey on January 12, 1935, which makes me a Capricorn, for what it is worth. My father is retired, formerly employed as a buffer by a battery company, and my mother, Lucy, is a housewife. My younger brother, Joe, is tall like my father, quiet and steady, also like my father, and he is a police officer in Cadwell, New Jersey, my hometown. It was and is a close and happy family. I still spend much of my available time with them. From my mother, I inherited a brisk walk and quick movements. I wish that I had truly inherited her laugh. It cuts glow. As a kid, sitting way down front in the local movie, I'd always know when she'd join the audience. Her laughter would be unmistakably first and last. She seldom missed a comedy, but the laughter would turn to silence whenever I began experimenting with magic. Deeply religious, she had a misunderstanding and a fear of the mystical field. She never really approved of what I was doing in the early days. I vaguely remember the incident that set me into show business at about the age of 5. My father took me along on a visit to friends and relatives in the hometown of Bethlehem, Pennsylvania. Neither of us can recall the exact house or the name of the people, but sometime during the stay, I was handed a comic book, probably to keep me occupied. A teenager, I think, gave me the new book, which contained 5 or 6 pages of Mandrake and the Magician. Vividly colored, electrically sparking from his fingertips and eyes, gesturing hypnotically, casting spells, crackling with excitement, Mandrake held my attention that day and for many days afterward. I came away with the book looking at it again and again on the train home. My father does remember that much. Once, over the next year, I began collecting every Mandrake comic I could find, spending all my allowance at the newsstand. Added soon were Action Comics and Marvel Comics, and in the back of Marvel was Zatara, a magician who was somewhat similar to Mandrake, using mystical powers to solve crimes. While Mandrake gestured hypnotically, Xantara would change an opponent's gun into a flower. When he wanted something to happen, he'd say it backwards. OGPU meant go up. Then he'd fly through the air. There was also Ibis, the invincible, and Egyptian who had died 6,000 years ago. Reincarnated, he used a magic wand called the Ibis stick. I lost myself in Mandrake and Zatara and Isaac, and of course I carved my own Isaac stick. Soon I began working with decks of cards and sleight of hand, while the other kids were struggling on roller skates in front of our apartment house, which was located on the main street of Cadwell. I was learning the quick shuffle, trying to fan cards, manipulating them, popping them out of a sleeve. After seeing movie routines, I also learned how to juggle. Then came Huck, Buckle, Beanstalk. To those who don't recognize it by that knee pants name, it's the ancient game of hot and cold. A player leaves the room and the rest of the class hides a beanbag. The player returns and begins to look for the bag, with the class shouting, getting hotter or getting colder. I was then in the 4th grade. Wouldn't it be great, I told my parents, if the object could be found without all the directions, just by having the hiders think about where it was. With the blessing of childhood, I didn't know the rules, what could be done, what couldn't. I tried it with my parents and had no success. Naturally, they lost interest. But then I persuaded Joe to try it. I literally forced him to practice with me for about 4 months. By the end of that time, I could find almost any object in our small, cluttered room without him saying hot or cold. I had no idea what I was doing, nor how much I was reading his facial expressions. A lot, probably, as I neared the object, but now I realized I was blindly beginning to train myself in sensitivity and ESP. The same year, excuse me, I recall, I was given permission to study the entire psychology section's adult books in the Cladwell Public Library. Not understanding 1/5 of what I was reading, I stuck with them, eagerly awaiting the next book. All the while remained faithful to Mandrake and kept collecting him. Sometimes dreamt of him, but then I'd also heard of Houdini and the Great Thurston. Next to Mandrake, created by Lee Falk, they were my childhood heroes. Christmas of that year, my parents gave me a book on Thurston. It was quite a year. I'd learned how to pull a tablecloth from beneath a set of dishes without breaking them, a juggler routine, and had demonstrated the trick in class and at assembly. About a week later, Mr. Johnson, the principal, called me into the office to request that I never repeat it, much less give instructions. Dishes were being broken all over Cadwell. But it wasn't long before I was doing a half-hour private show every Friday night at my grandparents', the Catonials, who lived about a quarter of a mile away. My Aunt Ruth Catelio, my mother's sister, would wait at the kitchen table for me and then summon my grandparents for the performance. I tried to display a new effect each week. They'd applaud, and I would bow. Cladwell was then a rather rural community, trolley line to Newark, running down the center of Bloomfield Avenue, flanked by the huge old leafy trees. Spring and summer were delightful, with the quality of a quiet, small American town. There was plenty of running room and fields in which to play cowboys and cops and robbers. We were centrally located, to say the least. The Catholic Church, where I never missed a Sunday Mass, was directly across the street from our apartment. Behind us was the police station, and to the left was the public library. Then on the other side, the only newspaper in town. On one corner was a Shell gas station, still there, now run by a close friend of mine. Bells tolled. The trolley ran, and everyone knew everyone else. Christmas, Easter, the 4th of July, and Thanksgiving were sensational. Life as I recall it now was mostly warm and loving, and really didn't know the difference between middle class and any other class. Sunday was reserved for dinner at Grandma Cotillo's with spaghetti and the main course, and I spent a lot of time in that old house, often eating weekday meals there. I listened to Aunt Ruth play the piano and eventually learned by ear, then took lessons. Grandfather Catino was our second home, and I'd always march in the annual Italian-American Day Parade with him. I don't think my father has read more than a dozen books in his whole life, but he'd often take me to the bookstore in the area, sometimes going into New York. We'd look at all the books on entertainers, especially on magicians. On these trips, my father often talked about entertainers he'd seen and told stories about them that he'd heard. Later, my mother took me to Manhattan for Arthur Godfrey's broadcasts. She had a daily radio kitchen romance with Godfrey. Although it wasn't really intentional on their part, my parents constantly orientated me towards the stage. But it was probably a story about America's first famous modern magician, Harry Keller, that sent me headlong into The Conjuring. The incident had taken place around the turn of the century in St. George's Hall in London, home of the world's best magic. An elaborate magician named David Devant. Best of his day, he performed nightly in St. George's using effects primarily created by master technician Neville Maskelyne. The team operated the theater and devoted entirely to magic. Keller had heard that Devant was practicing a form of levitation devised by Maskelyne and took a steamer to Europe, hoping to add the effect to his already acclaimed American show. Few magicians have been able to resist attempting some form of body flotation. Keller was stunned, as mystified as the rest of the audience. When a lady was sent to float up gradually from a couch on stage, apparently in a trance, she moved away from the background of the scenery toward the center of the stage. To heighten the illusion, Devant passed a steel hoop around her body. Night after night, Keller returned to his seat in St. George's to study the effect. Inevitably, he went backstage to offer Maskelyne a tremendous sum for the secret of his levitation technique. Maskelyne, of course, turned him down. A few nights later, the frustrated Keller jumped out of his seat and went to the front of the audience, then up on the stage, determined to discover the mechanics the British magician was employing. After an angry scene, he was ushered off. But he did bring back to New York a man named Validon, who had been an assistant to both David Dupont and Mascalini. In 2 years, Keller had his own levitation effect, and it was far more sophisticated than the incredible act that took place in St. George's Hall. He worked on a fully lit stage and climbed a ladder to pass the hoop around the subject. What struck me, reading about this at the age of 9, was the lengths to which Keller had gone in order to create a few minutes of amusement and entertainment. He traveled an ocean and managed to spirit away the right-hand man of Devant and Mascalini. Eventually, Keller taught the illusion to Howard Thurston, but there were personality clashes between them, and Keller willed that it be sold to Harry Blackstone, another illustrious name in The Conjuring. For the sum of $1, Harry Blackstone Jr. still has the bill of sale. However, it was the great Thorsten who died a year later. I was born, who carried the levitation illusion to near ultimate. The most elaborate of all American magicians, Thurston invited people up on stage to search for wires and examine the girl as she floated. He magnanimously gave the steel hoop to an audience member, defying him to find any supports. He captured the routine with incomparable showmanship by permitting a member of the audience to touch Sleeping Beauty's ring, swearing that they wished would come true. Thurston's 2 or 3 hour performance were spellbinding, according to my research. Then I began to study Houdini, who had changed his real name, Ickrich Wise, after the great French magician Houdin. Harry Houdini was a rabbi's son who at the age of 9 was a wire act performer with Jack Hollifer's circus. He was an escaped artist, athlete, pioneering pilot, and parachutist, not a formal magician. I could never get over the fact that he was afraid to drive a car. The daredevil said he was too nervous to drive a car, although he was obsessed with exploits of trickery and illusion. Houdini still envied magicians. His act lasted only about 20 minutes, and he had little else up his considerable sleeve. This bereavement of his act was one reason why he took on all comers. He reaped publicity. When one Rathman Bey came to New York to do a buried alive act in a coffin on stage, surviving with very little air, Houdini quickly let it be known that he would expose the Indian impostor. Forbes was reportedly baffled. A short time after Houdini was lowered into the pool of a New York hotel in a similar coffin and stayed submerged for almost an hour and a half, beating Babe's time by 15 minutes. Houdini then claimed that his accomplishment resulted from his natural state, but since Redmond Bay had been in a trance, he was an imposter. Both men, of course, had learned to lower their metabolic rate, relax their nervous system, and not consume air. They were in exactly the same condition and not entranced. But the Houdini legend continues as well as it should. No one has come close to duplicating his feats. What I learned from Houdini was that he often spent 18 hours on days that he didn't perform, perfecting his escape routines. I began to understand the time and effort necessary to go beyond simple card effects and disappearing coins. Born too late for the age of magic, I tried to relive it through books. I saw Harry Blackstone perform on only 2 occasions and wouldn't have been more dazzled on the first occasion. Had Devant and Keller been up there too? A handkerchief borrowed from the audience danced all over the stage. Blackstone was smiling, master of it all, a lovely memory. The last good American magician that I saw at work was the man named Dante. He had white hair and a white goatee and a devilish gleam in his eyes. Indeed, he looked like Mesoponic. He could materialize burrows. Chapter 5. With my father, or sometimes with both our parents, Joe and I often went to Bethlehem, the rugged steel town just across the Jersey border 2 hours away. My father's relatives lived in an apartment house there, occupying 3 of the 4 units. Remarkably, those not deceased still live in the same place, a big square stucco building at the foot of a high hill. Upstairs on the left side lived Aunt Helen and Uncle Butch Sigata, a foreman at the steel mill. Downstairs on the right-hand side lived Aunt Anna and her husband, John Pikukowski. Over them, their son, Eddie, and daughter-in-law, Marina. As far back as I can remember, 4 of the family gathered each day for a game of 500 rummy. They'd shout up and down the stairs to get a game going. But as a child, I could never quite understand the peculiar Polish humor. The minute our family walked through the door, the Bethlehem relatives would yell, "Hey, when you going home?" There was much laughter in that apartment house. Marina devoted a lot of time to me. She'd never gone to college, but had read many books. She'd talk about mystery and things that couldn't be explained and about fascinating people. She was interested in show business. Aunt Anna was also of great influence. She was short, wore her hair in a bun, European style. Gold-rimmed glasses were perched on her nose. She had a quiet, rattling laugh that I could still hear. how much of the time she couldn't get around very well, which was one reason for the daily rummy sessions. One of my earliest memories of Aunt Anna was seeing her experimenting with a form of automatic writing. She would touch a pencil lightly to a piece of paper on a table. After a while, the pencil would begin to move nervously. I couldn't have been more than 6 when I watched the jerky movements in Aunt Hannah with a faraway look in her face. I also remember that she once predicted that a friend of hers, one she hadn't seen or heard from in a long time, would soon pay her a visit. It was during an OD board session with my Aunt Helen. 5 minutes later, a telegram announced the impending visit of the friend. I was terribly impressed. Aunt Anna often played with the Ouija board, and I was often opposite her. Later, having the nerve to tell her just how it worked, which she dismissed, once I very seriously informed her that it was an unconsciousness response, a bit of brilliance extracted from my borrowed library books, interpreted 100% wrong. Anna apparently took all this in stride and gladly lent herself to hours of experimentation. Eventually, I did help her overcome insomnia through suggestion, and I trained her to fall asleep within 30 seconds after reading a slip of paper I'd given her. When I was in my teens, one of the best comic books ever published began to appear in the magazine section of the Cadwell drugstore a few blocks away. Super Magician Comics was not about Mandrake or Ibis, but all about real magicians solving crimes around the world by using their illusions. Blackstone was one of them. I still have the books and cherish them. But even before super magicians came to town, I had decided to become a professional conjurer. I had put together an act. Some of the effects were rather elaborate, but all were homemade or home built. Aunt Ruth Coutinho had made me a tailcoat complete with inner pockets. I had tried out my act at school or at the Coutinhos or down in Bethlehem, where Aunt Helen or Aunt Anna would lure as many as 60 people, usually all Polish, into the stucco apartment house for a show. So at 10, I began performing professionally in New Jersey, New York, and Pennsylvania, billed as the world's youngest hypnotist. An advertisement that was more come on than truth. My hypnotic subjects, children from the audience, were seldom cooperative. I was fumbling and awkward. My first true hypnotic subject was Aunt Anna. We did a show in Bethlehem, my first before an entire adult audience, and I had her under in 2 or 3 minutes. I remember she was holding a pencil. I told her it was a rose. She sniffed it, then I told her it was an onion. She made a face and tossed it away. Then I ended the demonstration by telling her that she was stuck to the chair and wouldn't be able to get up. We got great laughs and applause as she struggled to separate herself from the seat. Family played an important role in the beginning. They gathered the audiences Over in Allentown, relatives named Prorock took care of that area. In Bethlehem, it worked well until too many people began showing up in the apartment house, 200 on one occasion. Then the relatives began fighting over who would sponsor the show. Finally, we moved it to St. Michael's Hall, a Polish meeting place up on the hill. I performed there for a dozen straight summers. For school performances or birthday parties, the going rate was $10 or $12 for a 2-hour show. I pumped most of it back into props or buying effects that I couldn't build. For church performances, I did many of them. The hat was passed with varying success, $15 the first time. The numbers began to show some polish. I remember I tried out an effect in Helen Galloway's 6th grade class. It was called the Rice Bowl, a Chinese effect. China has always produced good magicians, but they've been slow in developing new effects. Until the early 40s, they had 6 basic effects, all passed down from generation to generation. Bringing 2 large cereal bowls to class, I filled one to the top with rice and then covered it with another bowl. Shaking them, I opened them again and both bowls were overflowing with rice, spilling to the table and onto the floor. The next step was to place them together again, and on separation, one would be filled with water, symbolic of Chinese rice and water. I improved on the effect by filling the bowls with rice, but then pulling a large bouquet of flowers instead of water from the emptied one, followed by an almost endless stream of paper that cascaded to the floor, piling around my knees. Then I'd stop and bend over to pick it up. Just then, the streamer would begin to wiggle, and I'd reach into it, pulling out my pet rabbit, Houdini. Meanwhile, I was trying to do all sorts of things with hypnotism, trying to mind read, collecting anything about magic or psychic experiments instead of stamps or baseball cards. Some members on my father's side of the family became alarmed at one point. I suddenly acquired a small reputation for having an evil eye and being able to cast a spell. I'm not sure I didn't enjoy the status, though it was kept pretty quiet. One time I went into Barwin's store in Bethlehem and bought something. After I left, one of my relatives came in. The store owner complained of a headache, which had started just about the time I'd entered. That mushroomed into a similar incident, and soon, to some quarters of the Polish side of the family, I was George the Evil-Eyed. The Polish name for it is Porabiti. I lived it down, but to this day, some of my relatives still give me some strange looks. Schoolwork was never a problem, although I wasn't a straight-A student, and Helen Galloway, now the principal of the same school, encouraged me at a time when belief in anything remotely psychic brought about a deathwish reaction. She told me to ignore those who thought I was odd because I played mind games and to keep on exploring. There was also a 7th grade teacher, Mrs. Stafford, a large dramatic woman who continued where Helen Galloway left off. One question would provoke an hour's discussion. She was fascinated with the possibility of thought perception. Of course, magic performances continued while I was in high school, sometimes 3 dates a week. I performed for Boy Scout troops, Girl Scout groups, civic clubs, churches, schools, any organization willing to guarantee $15 or $20 a show. Booking myself, I ran ads in various papers, sent out mailers, and prepared my own press releases. I'd outgrown the homemade tailcoat, and the Bethlehem relatives, having forgiven my evil eye, had contributed a second-hand tuxedo. Although Joe and I always had a sibling rivalry and fought often, he was my efforts' guinea pig, lending himself to some pretty wild routines. One twilight, my mother almost dropped her bag of groceries on opening the front door. Joe was levitated 3 or 4 feet off the living room floor, sitting in a yoga position. My mother was startled on more than one occasion. Thurston had a floating ball illusion, sending a steel spear around the stage and then out over the audience. Blackstone had his version and his vision. I finally worked out the mechanics of the illusion, but employed a light bulb, keeping it lit and floating it around. The day I perfected it, my mother happened into the dining room where I was floating the bulb, passing it back and forth through a hoop. She let out a eek. Some of my many chemistry and science experiments also created momentarily upsets. I remember that an attempt to manufacture dense fog in the kitchen didn't go over too well, but each of the efforts, successes or failures, added something to the performance. If the shows were 30 minutes, I'd work alone. If they were 2 hours, Joe would come along as an assistant. Looking back, I imagine they were staged as professionally as possible. To open a typical program, I'd walk out in my tuxedo, coming through the curtains, carrying a cane, bowing and smiling, split a pyre Blackstone. I'd hold the cane in front of me and change it to a silk handkerchief, shake the handkerchief, and produce a bouquet of flowers. Then the curtain would open, and I'd step back to the various effects tables or cabinets on stage. One of my favorites was the Miser's Dream, an effect often used by adult magicians. I renamed it the Storm of Coins. Walking to the simple table in the center of the stage, I'd tap it with a wand, tossing the wand to Joe, and then produce a $50 from my fingertips, dropping it into a pail. Rapid fire, I'd pop about 10 more, and then more. Off stage and into the audience, pulling coins from earlobes and noses. Back on stage, I'd clatter 30 or 40 coins into the pail, then cap the routine by changing money, upending the pail with $100 bills would flutter out. Turning to cards, I'd spring a deck from one hand to the other, shuffle it dramatically, and then throw the cards singularly into the air, and they'd disappear. tossing the rest of that deck into a top hat. I'd pop another one and begin fanning them, about 20 cards in each fan, finally doing a vanishing effect with 3 or 4 decks. Moving quickly to more complicated illusions, I had someone from the audience select a card from a deck and then place it in a container given to me by a former magician named Reed, who worked at the Bright Star Battery Company with my father. Exposing the container so that the audience could see it, I'd burn the card and then walk to a picture frame on the other end of the stage, flinging a scarf over the frame, returning swiftly to the container. I'd lift the lid off and whip out a half dozen scarves. Back at the picture frame, I'd yank the scarf and expose the previously burned card. Striking back to the table, I'd pick up a box which had no lid or front. It was empty except for a small amount of web work. Throwing it up, I'd catch it to reveal my rabbit nestled inside. Usually I'd follow that effect by draping a large cloth over my shoulders and turning back. I would produce another bouquet of flowers, all different colors. I'd freeze, do a telltale spin, pause, tipping off the audience that something else would happen. Then I'd produce a large bowl of water. It always brought the house down. After that, I'd do a spiritualistic thing, cause a ball to float around my shoulder and in front of me, holding up a scarf, stretching it tight horizontally. I'd send the ball back and forth over the edge. Later on, before intermission, Joe would come out with an alarm clock and a black cloth. With the usual exaggerated gestures, I'd set the alarm and have it go off. Quickly wrap the clock in the cloth and toss it all into the air. At apex, the alarm bell would stop and the cloth would fall back to the stage minus the clock. On most shows, I learned something about timing and audience communication. I began to sense the squirm point. Soon I could almost feel the excitement or boredom and would know when an illusion was not obtaining the right results. If the show was some distance away, my father would drive us, then stand in the back of the auditorium and listen to comments. No one knew who he was, and I learned a great deal from his eavesdropping. I picked up some showmanship pointers. Most entertainers could do no better than have a friend stand in the back of the room or in the lobby and just listen. After the shows, we'd hear back from Cadwell. My father would pass on whatever information he'd heard and then lapse into silence. We'd drive through town after town in the misty early hours of the morning. Joe often fell asleep in the back seat, which was usually crammed with equipment. He was curled around cabinets used for effects. I remember those rides as long as I shall live. What a solid opportunity those nights offered for grounding in theater and showmanship. I can recall a very rainy night when I was junior in high school and gave a 2-hour show to raise money for the class. I was beginning to memory demonstrations when one of the stand lights behind the curtain exploded. The curtain lining began to burn, and white smoke enveloped me at stage center. Not aware of the fire, the audience assumed that the bang of the lamp and the smoke were some type of magical effect. I somehow remained calm and kept going with a memory demonstration while several of the stage crew extinguished the curtain and unplugged the sparkling lamp. But that type of presence is unknowingly developed by repeated appearances before live audiences. One day you wake up and have it. You really don't know how you got it. During this same time period, I discovered that I was more interested in audience reaction than in what I was doing on stage. It was satisfying to have the illusions work, but of great satisfaction was the communication from beyond the footlights, the sensing of excitement, the submission to mystery. I began to realize what audience rapport meant and what it required. In my mid-teens, I was beginning to experiment constantly with ESP, attempting to perceive thoughts and plant them. My subjects were mostly fellow students. At times, they would be aware of it. It reached a point, however, when I had to use caution in exercising what was beginning an acquired ability, improving yearly in order to keep a circle of friends. By 17, my last year of high school, I was able to identify almost immediately any phone caller who was a personal friend. It was done automatically, without thought. I was receiving thought, hypersensitivity, and telepathy. The phone would ring, and I'd say, "Hi, Nancy." Before Nancy from Morgan could open her mouth, I did the same thing with Shirley Rollins, another girlfriend, and several guys who were close. Or I would reveal thoughts at lunch break. "You're worried about that test, aren't you?" Or if the guy got a D minus on his test and was thinking about it, I'd say, "You got a D minus, didn't you?" I didn't realize how unnerving it was. Word got out and around that George Kreskin was a little spooky. I untrained myself of that particular habit. Earning $150 and $200 a week now, $75 a show, I had no thoughts of further education. I already considered myself a professional and had even worked a nightclub by the time I had graduated from high school. My only thought was to now extend my play dates throughout the East and to the Midwest. My parents had resigned themselves to the fact that I would end up my schooling in Cladwell, and then Mrs. Mary Gruner, who taught English at Gladwell High, urged me to enter college. I said that I couldn't very well do that and still keep bookings throughout the country. "Do it part-time," she said. "Just take 2 courses." "Where?" "At Seton Hall University." It was only a half hour from my home farm for its basketball team. With no more prodding than that, I enrolled in Seton Hall with a major in psychology and a minor in Catholic philosophy. At the same time, I was about going professional all the way. I needed a stage name because I thought Preston, which is spelled Kresge, had little ring or flair. It also recalled the dime store, and I didn't want that comparison in reviews. I thought about using my father's Polish name of Goreza, along with many other Poles. He changed his name fearing prejudice, yet his name seemed a little heavy. Finally, from Harry Keller, I took the K from the French magician Houdini, the IN at the end of his name, and added them to the beginning of my family name. Thus, the stage name of Preston. Eventually, my legal name came about. I began to play dates in many eastern states and the Midwest, going as far as Illinois, catching my Seton Hall classes when I could. For a while, no month went by when I didn't agonize between my major and the excitement of performing. There was also the religious issue. I'm a good Catholic, I think, and at the time my hypnosis work was at some odds with the church. There was controversy within the church about the controlling of the will of a human being, and great stress was placed on the necessity of having freedom of will. Earlier, I had considered becoming a priest, Catholic philosophy deeply ingrained in me. I struggled with the question for several years, then reached my own decision. I was not controlling will. Hypnosis is not capable of it. My routine now featured hypnosis. I sent a mailer to 600 or 700 colleges and slowly began to travel the college circuit. I also worked nightclubs, private parties, conventions, and yet because of my age, 20 then, it was sometimes hard for me to realize I was a pro. After a fraternal organization reunion performance, I met an executive from Allstate Insurance Company. He asked, "What do you do? And what do you charge?" I told him my usual fee was $75 for an hour program, $100 for an hour and a half, and for a 2-hour show, $175. He said, "When my company calls you, tell them you want $400. I couldn't bring myself to do it. I played many dates for Allstate, but never charged more than $150. I finally broke this hang-up in 1956. Barbara Hamilton, a girl I knew, called to book me into St. Lawrence University in Canton, New York. She told me that they always had a hypnotist appear. She named one. "How much does he charge?" I asked. The answer was $500. "I want the same," I said bluntly. I'd now been hypnotizing for more than 10 years, and I believed I had a better show than performer X. The university refused, but the next year I played there for a single show at my new price. At last I had reached what I thought was big time. I felt much older than 20, yet knew I wasn't. It all had come about so slowly that it seemed there had been no changes since those nights riding with my father and Joe. There had been many, in fact, and my work was imperceptibly changing from magic to ESP. Meanwhile, I was a serious student of psychology whenever I could get a few days in a row to attend Seton Hall. The university, particularly Professor Frank Murphy, made allowances for the time factor, but not the course credits. It took me 9.5 years to graduate. My thesis was entirely practical. I spent months in research on, on the use of suggestion to improve bowling scores, excuse me. One bowler I worked with raised her average by 27 points, so it wasn't a total loss. I'm still not certain why I selected this subject instead of a more clinical area. One reason I'm sure is that I could evaluate the results by points rather than by theory. And then we'll start chapter 6, which will be on Thursday. I look to see everybody here that wants to join us. And other than that, I'm going to say everybody have a great and wonderful day. And I look forward to seeing any and all who want to join me on Thursday, February the 14th. And I thank you very much. And everyone have a great and wonderful day. Bye-bye.